Welcome to my show. A guest here. Her name is Michela Parisi. Mrs. Michela, how are you doing, ma?
I'm doing well, thanks. And it's Michaela, but don't worry about it. Nobody seems to get it right.
All right, ma. All right, Mrs. Michela. Firstly, you are a trauma coach. You are also a licensed clinical therapy. You are also a board certified neurofeedback clinician. Can you please, ma, discuss more about yourself and how you are doing currently now, ma?
Yeah, so I started pursuing my master's degree in clinical counseling, just having a passion for mental health a handful of years ago. And during that time, I discovered neurofeedback therapy, which is at its simplest form, a way to regulate brain waves in order to alleviate mental health symptoms like anxiety, depression, things like that without medication. So there are very few options for that out there. And so I fell in love with that modality and started an in-person practice integrating those two modalities so we could regulate the brain and process information and traumas through talk therapy. And so from there, our practice really grew organically because there's such a need for that. After that, I pursued the coaching realm as well. So I do both now, and I also teach therapists how to have a business model and a practice that integrates both of these modalities as well. So that's the coaching and the trauma piece because that's the niche that I focus on. But the learning curve, I guess, to understanding neurofeedback and how to integrate it into a business can be intimidating to therapists, but it's so beneficial for both therapists and clients that that's where my focus is right now.
All right, thank you so much, Mrs. Michela. And do you also have any book you are planning to write in the coming future, ma?
Oh, I see. No, I'm not planning on writing a book in the future. I'm really focused on the clinical work and just working with therapists right now.
All right, ma. Firstly, can you please, ma, tell us what really happens in the brain and nervous system when someone experiences trauma, ma?
Yeah. So there are two common responses to trauma that I'll talk about first, and then we can go through the cycle
Okay.
of how kind of they integrate with each other. So in general, after a traumatic experience, people experience both nervous systems shutting down. So you can think like disassociation, um, you can think of, avoidance, brain fog, memory loss, things like that. And then also this like fight or flight response where there's more of like an overactivation in the nervous system. So there's like panic attacks, anxiety, nightmares, things like that. So both of these are common responses, but there's a cycle that the nervous system goes through, which I really pull from education and exposure therapy to understanding this. So for any therapists who are looking for more information on how this process works, just doing a basic training on exposure therapy will get them that information. But what happens is we experience something traumatic and our nervous system goes, wow, that's an overwhelming feeling. And it also doesn't make sense, whether that's childhood abuse or a car accident. Our nervous system can't quite make sense of it in the moment. And so it shuts down. This is disassociation. This is kind of that numb feeling or just like a lack of feeling that you experience in the moment. And this is actually a really healthy response because our body and our nervous system is trying to protect us. However, what happens is we get kind of stuck in that state. And it's almost like the energy of that state tries to trickle out, where over time, if we haven't had adequate time to process this, like with a therapist or with somebody in the moment to make some sense of these intense feelings, we start to experience anxiety or flashbacks or hypervigilance. So the nervous system basically tries to release that energy through these really uncomfortable symptoms. And that's a good sign that trauma might have been experienced. So, those signals right there, whenever a client comes in and says they're experiencing one of those symptoms, it's a good signal to us that the trauma hasn't been processed through language and talk therapy, through something like neurofeedback, through just a really healthy connection and attachment to somebody who's able to hold their story and hear it. Because after somebody does do that for them, a client's able to regulate themselves and kind of shift out of both that disassociated state and the fight or flight state to more of this middle ground regulated space. Um, but often people will get stuck in one of those stages, and we have to kind of work with them where they're at.
All right, thank you so much, Mrs. Michela. And how do you think trauma also impacts brain areas like the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex?
Yeah, so we can start with the amygdala. This is like it's like our radar for understanding where a threat is. So it's like our threat detector. So for example, if we're walking down the street at night and there's somebody on the other side of the road and you get this feeling like something might be unsafe, your amygdala, amongst many other parts of the brain, are kind of setting off the signal to pay attention, to be more alert. However, after a traumatic experience, the amygdala is working on overtime. It's trying to detect threats everywhere. So what happens is maybe your partner says something to you that really triggers you and sets you off. Though objectively, it might not be something that is going to induce fear in anybody. For you, if you've experienced trauma and maybe relational trauma, that's going to set you off. And so the amygdala is working on overtime to detect fear and threat, to detect threats, and then potentially induce fear where it's not actually accurate. And so that lends hand in hand with the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that's like our adult brain. It's designed to say, no, don't walk in front of the car when it's driving. Yes, go to sleep at 9 p.m. so you can wake up for that early meeting. It's the adult that's trying to keep us safe. And so the prefrontal cortex can also overfire. It can also underfire, but for the sake of this, we'll talk about overfiring because it goes hand in hand with what the amygdala does, overfiring, where then it's starting to overthink what needs to be done in order to stay safe. So that can really just look like ruminating anxiety. It can look like OCD. It can look like big emotional reactivity when paired with overactivation in the amygdala. But those two parts of the brain talk to each other quite a bit. The hippocampus is the last one, and this is really just where memories are processed and stored. So trauma tends to impact our memory because there's a handful of reasons, but the primary way that I look at it with clients is there's a finite amount of energy and electricity in our brain at all times. And so we want to delegate that energy and electricity to the locations where it's most needed. If we've experienced trauma, it is not important for us to be remembering where we put our keys or your friend's birthday, right? Like these things are lower on the levels of importance. It is more important to delegate that energy to hypervigilance, to awareness, to the stress response that the brain and body is living in order to try to prevent us from experiencing that trauma again. So the hippocampus just isn't working efficiently after something traumatic, which is why memory loss or just having trouble with short-term or long-term memory can show up.
Mm, thank you so much, Mrs. Michela. And are there any specific practices or tools that help rewire the brain and calm the nervous system?
Yeah. So from a talk therapy perspective, what's really interesting about this field is when someone experiences trauma, generally they will be recommended to go to therapy where we talk through the stressors of what happened. Some people take the approach, some therapists take the approach of diving right into the trauma, almost in an exposure therapy type way, where hopefully that therapist is skilled in how they are bringing that individual back into those emotions so they can process them more efficiently and safely. Some therapists don't dive right into it. Exposure therapy tends to be a pretty good approach to processing trauma, but everybody has their own blend of how they work with this. But the interesting thing about trauma and the nervous system is talking through what has happened is helpful, but it doesn't hit on like the core needs of the nervous system, which is like somatic safety. And we get to somatic safety through feeling. So through touch, through the senses. So being in a really warm, cozy chair, feeling safe in a room. These things that talk therapy actually can inadvertently provide, but they aren't the only piece of the puzzle. So it's really important from a talk therapy perspective to have some sort of somatic work that teaches the client how to feel more safe in their nervous system, which actually doesn't involve reliving the trauma. It involves teaching them to reconnect with their body after they've disassociated from it because those feelings are really intense. However, neurofeedback is one of the coolest ways that I've found to, and one of the most effective ways as well, to work with trauma because it involves no talking. We are teaching the brain to let go of these stuck electrical patterns right off the bat by reminding the brain that it knows how to shift out of a heightened state or a disassociated state. So, therapy might be an important part of the puzzle, just depending on where the client's at. But if a client has access to neurofeedback therapy and they are either not wanting to relive the trauma through talk therapy, which is very understandable, or they're just looking for something different to help them feel better in a more passive way without talking, neurofeedback is the best recommendation I have for clients.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Michela. Um, how do early childhood, this is a very important one, early childhood experiences shape the nervous system and influence trauma responses later in life, ma?
Yeah, so if we're going back to the earliest childhood experience, attachment
Mm,
is the biggest piece that we look at as therapists. Most attachment is developed, through their primary caregivers prior to an individual's memory even being formed. So, ages 2 to 5, prior to those ages is when all of these attachment patterns are being formed and somewhat solidified. And I say solidified lightly because you can change attachment patterns as you get older, but this kind of blueprint that we're going to walk through the world with and maybe do our best to alter as we get older if we realize we have some unhealthy coping mechanisms is developed really, really young. And that really imprints the nervous system with the lens that we look at the world through. So, for example, if there's a primary caregiver for a 2-year-old child who is inattentive to their needs, who is potentially abusive emotionally and or physically, that child's nervous system is going to take those memories subconsciously with them through the rest of their life, and look for, they might be looking for a self-fulfilling prophecy, so they might attract more of what they've experienced. They might also veer really, really far away from staying close to somebody in order to avoid what they've felt before. And we're hoping to get them to more of that middle ground of being able to recognize potentially traumatic relationships that could happen in adulthood and feel the self-confidence and self-ability to move away from those as they need to or move closer to the ones that feel healthy. So whenever we're working with attachment and early childhood experiences, I really like to remind clients that it's not just the relationship they had when they were 13 that deeply impacted them, that's influencing their attachment style. Like there's so much of this that was out of their control as a child that now we're managing and understanding as adults, which sort of takes the pressure and the burden off of these individuals to feel like they have to own everything that's happened to them with some level of responsibility, but more so placing that responsibility on them now as an adult to just own the cards they've been dealt and decide what we do to move through that together in the future.
thank you so much, Mrs. Michela. I know might have gotten some success stories in your coaching career. What's, success story from your coaching experience as demonstrate how someone can overcome trauma, ma?
Yeah, so I'm always blown away by the impacts of how somebody with really intense trauma who's done a lot of talk therapy can benefit so significantly in really dramatic ways from pursuing talk therapy with a licensed therapist who specializes in trauma paired with neurofeedback. Like that tends to be the secret sauce. And so, I have clients who feel very stuck. It's really common for individuals to call me and say like, I'm just so sick of talking. And I am ready for something different. I'm ready to feel better, but talk therapy isn't the answer. I don't want to take medication. And these individuals, when they start neurofeedback, which is a long process, they're with us twice a week for 40 to 60 sessions. So it's a good amount of time. Their nervous system is getting regulated in the background. And then as that happens, there tends to be these like emotional bumps, we could call them, where maybe a memory resurfaces, or maybe they're feeling extra sensitive and feeling like they need to process something that they've talked about before with their therapist, but for some reason it's feeling important to revisit it now. These things come up, and because in talk therapy we can dig into that head first with an exposure therapy model, and then immediately after that, hook them up for neurofeedback and regulate their nervous system so they don't stay in this heightened emotional state. Their brain is learning during that time that it's okay and it's safe to go into those spaces and those feelings rather than, wow, that was way too intense. I don't want to go back there. So it creates this positive cycle. And I see clients all the time coming in just saying, I feel like a new person after that last session. Like, I didn't know I could feel this good. You can look at our reviews online. Like, those are clients saying, like, my life has changed from
Mm,
this, which, the type of results that we get from talk therapy are incremental, they're slower. They're relational, meaning we have to build a healthy attachment between client and therapist in order to really get these deeper movements and results. And that can take years and years. And with talk therapy paired with neurofeedback in this specific pattern and the specific program that we have, um, clients come in and say, like, I am a different person. And those types of success stories are they really impact you as a therapist because your goal is to help, and being able to see those results faster and more significantly is pretty incredible for all parties involved.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Michela. And there will always be an important thing someone should understand about something. What do you think is the most important thing people should understand about the connection between trauma and the nervous system?
I think that healthy attachment in the moment is something that's often overlooked.
Mm,
So, to elaborate on that more, if somebody experiences a car accident, in the moment, we're doing, people who come to help are there to physically keep that individual safe. And of course, that is a huge priority. It's not one to be missed. And let's say somebody pulls them out of the car, they set them on the side of the road, they're letting them heal. That individual is processing and almost like turtling in on themselves in order to stay safe emotionally. If in those moments we were able to have trained professionals who are able to use an exposure therapy model to help that individual make sense of what happened to them with unconditional positive regard, meaning there's no judgment, there is no guidance, there are no suggestions. We're really just piecing together what happened in a way that validates that individual's feelings unconditionally. They don't have to go through this trauma cycle nearly as intensely, if at all, afterwards because we've done that intense trauma work in the moment. But that's not necessarily a part of our society. Even many trauma therapists are not deeply understanding of how that works. And so there's a level of education both for average individuals and healthcare providers and mental health providers and understanding how to respond to crisis in the moment. Um, and there's a level of just changing the narrative around how trauma has to impact us because it doesn't have to live with us for years and years and years. It will change you. Trauma will not, fly by and we'll be okay with it one day, but it doesn't have to relive, you don't have to relive it with anxiety and flashbacks and nightmares for the years and years that most people tend to live with it if we're able to approach it properly in the moment. And so that's kind of become one of my passions is educating clients on how that process works in their nervous system. So not only do they have a therapeutic understanding of it, but like the psychoeducation piece of it tends to go a long way, especially in validating clients because then they don't feel like they're crazy or there's something wrong with them for having responded to something difficult in the way that they did.
All right, thank you so much, Mrs. Michela. And lastly, there is a question I normally ask ma from the ancestors, from the forefathers. There are a lot of things that is missing in our ancestral time, you know, in our time today. If there is anyone that you would like to bring back to our time today, what do you think that thing would be, ma?
Um, I think there's probably a lot of people, but my grandmother was a huge influence in my life. She was a wild, wild woman who passed away, gosh, 6, 7 years ago now. And she had uh, an energy to her that is truly unlike anybody else I've met before. She worked for herself starting at 16, had a restaurant in a small town of 500 people for almost 50 years. She was independent in a time where independence for women was way more difficult. And she was just joyful during that time. She was just spunky and fun and grateful and worked really, really hard and took care of people. I mean, people would come to her in the middle of the night in this little town, and she was the person you go to for help. And that type of deep connection to community, in addition to a good work ethic and positivity, is just, it's not something you find anymore. And so, if I could bring somebody back, it'd be her. And I'd probably just absorb more of whatever she did to get to that attitude because um, it's rare and it's infectious when you're around it. And so, she's deeply missed. And it's too bad she couldn't have had more years to impact people with all of that.
Yes, that's very true. When someone loves someone will just want to feel like being with that person just for the rest of his or her life. But the truth of the world is just the truth. May our perfect soul continue to rest in peace. Mrs. Michela, I want to personally thank you for the topic, on the nervous system and trauma. Thank you so much, ma.
Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
All right, ma. Bye bye.
Bye bye.